explore the impacts that proposed climate legislation will have on the agriculture industry and the effect that it will have on consumers. The House Democratic leadership has spent the last 2 months rushing to pass a carbon emissions reduction scheme that I call cap and tax. I call it cap and tax because the legislation is a hidden energy tax that will increase the price of nearly every staple in American life, including electricity, goods and services, and gasoline. Today's hearing will allow us to explore how this flawed policy will hurt American farmers. Cap and tax will reduce the security of America's food supply. If the government mandates a cap on fossil fuel emissions, many utilities will switch from coal to natural gas to generate electricity because natural gas produces fewer CO2 emissions. As demand for natural gas rises, the price will rise as well. But natural gas isn't used solely for electricity. As Ford West, president of the Fertilizer Institute, says in his written testimony, there is no substitute for natural gas in nitrogen production. The U.S. domestic nitrogen fertilizer industry supplied about 85% of America's nitrogen in the 1990s, but the high cost of natural gas has moved much of this production and its jobs overseas. Today, just 55% of this vital farming resource is made in the United States. Much of the imported nitrogen is made in places that offer cheap natural gas like the Middle East, China, Russia, and Venezuela. These countries have no restrictive climate policies like cap and tax, and their energy efficiency is generally lower than that in the United States. Mr. West cites a study by the Doan Advisory Services that shows that a cap and tax scheme would add $6 to $12 billion in additional costs for farmers by 2020. A recent study by the Heritage Foundation on the Democrats' cap and tax proposal also shows the devastating effects this scheme will have on agriculture. Farmers will be forced to pay more, and those costs will be reflected in the price of nearly every agricultural product. The Heritage study shows that increases in costs are expected to reduce farmers' incomes by $8 billion in 2012 and by more than $50 billion in 2035. The average net income loss between 2010 and 2035 is projected to be $23 billion. With numbers like these, it isn't surprising that 37 food and agriculture groups have opposed the cap and tax legislation. In addition to expanding taxes, cap and tax will expand the government, especially the Environmental Protection Agency. Because enforcement of a true carbon cap would debilitate the U.S. economy, the legislative proposal currently before the House of Representatives allows covered entities to make substantial portions of their reduction outside the cap, though through what are called offsets. The bill allows 2 billion tons of offsets per year, a billion of which must come from domestic sources. The value of these billion offsets will easily reach into the tens of billions. Because the cap is so broad, agriculture and forestry are the only areas where offsets can be applied. The result will be tens of billions of tax dollars flowing into the farm industry. As financial and auto industries have learned, federal money does not come without strings. Under the current bill, the EPA will be in charge of pulling these strings, and the EPA has no useful experience regulating agriculture. We've already got a whiff of what would happen if the EPA tries to regulate greenhouse gases. The American Farm Bureau Federation has said that if the EPA were to apply the Clean Air Act to greenhouse gases, nearly every dairy, cattle, and swine farm would fall under the regulations, resulting in literally a cow flatulence tax. The EPA has sworn this isn't their plan, but to exclude these farms from the regulations, the EPA would have to take steps to exempt them, steps that could be challenged in court. This is the kind of absurd regulation that is exactly the type of policy we could see if the EPA becomes too involved in regulating greenhouse gases in agriculture production. Republicans believe that any climate change legislation must meet 4 simple principles. It must protect jobs in the economy, produce tangible improvements to the environment, advance technological progress, and feature international participation, including that of China and India. If we keep these principles in mind, we can address climate without threatening American farmers or our economic health, and I thank the Chair.